questions. I know there's going to be a lot of things related to the contemporary subjects of the microwave radiation, 4G and 5G. I'm actually going to be taking a different angle with my presentation because I think there are a lot of very good websites out there that can fill people in on this topic. And I'm going to take it from a little bit different angle to make people think differently about the body and physics than what we may have thought or what we learned in school or what we see in the media. And then from that reality, we can start to think about how the body really works, okay?
Perfect.
So I'm going to share my screen. So to introduce myself as I'm doing this, can people see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I'm a professor at the University of Arizona. My main appointment is medical imaging, which is also known as radiology. So I'm in the College of Medicine. I also have appointments in optical sciences, biomedical engineering, and neurosurgery. I also own a medical device company, kind of a startup company here in Tucson, Electrosonics. And most of the slides that I present will actually not be directly related to my research or company in any way, although I use these types of energies for imaging primarily. I'm going to give you a little bit different angle on how to think about the body and the universe, I guess, in general. So I'm going to start with a couple quotes, and I'm going to be taking a very historical perspective here because I do think things really changed about 100 years ago, and it's not just about the microwave technology and how microwaves affect the body. It has to do with electricity in general. It has to do with the healthcare system, big pharma as we know it. A lot of changes took place 100 years ago, and I think to really understand what's going on today, you have to take a look at that history. And that's going to include in my talk some people you might not have heard of, including technologies that were simply suppressed or forgotten. And I think they're very relevant today, and we need to look again at those. So I'm going to get into this. So Nikola Tesla said, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So I have a little cartoon here where it shows is electricity the key to life? And a quote from Einstein, everything is energy. And that's all there is to it. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you cannot help but get that reality. It can be no other way. This is not philosophy, this is physics. And I think as you'll see, we aren't listening to the great physicists from 75 years ago when we think about the body or how we treat the body, and we'll get into that in a second. So let's just first look at our healthcare system. And these are just facts that you can look up. They're probably actually worse than that since when these numbers were taken. But our system makes a lot of money. It's very good at making money, as you guys probably know. So prescription drug sales are $500 billion a year. There's over 100,000 deaths per year taking prescription drugs as prescribed, and it's actually quite a bit more than that. That's from a Harvard study from 15 years ago. As you probably know, to approve a new drug in our system, it can take 10 or 15 years. Those are the success stories and cost $500 million. And really, most of the drugs that we still use today were developed, like for cancer, you got doxorubicin, which is a chemotherapy drug, and Taxol. Those were both developed decades ago. And even the ones that are approved, more than half of those are removed from the market. So I'm setting the stage here that our system is not working very well, and so we got to look at where we're getting information, and we also have to look at where it's successful. And it's very good and has been at making money. In fact, there's no profitable industry that is better than the pharmaceutical industry. And yet I have a quote there from William Osler who said, the first duty of the physician is to educate the masses not to take medicine. So we seem to be doing the opposite of what people that came before told us to do. So one of the issues comes in actually about 150 years ago, and I want to go back there because this is pivotal to the healthcare system that we have today, which is very much based on the germ theory. We've heard a lot about germs recently, viruses, bacteria, microbes, and that comes from Louis Pasteur, who developed that theory, again, 150 years ago. And the theory was based on the fact that microbes are bad and they cause disease. And you get an invasion of these microbes, and you've got to do something with it. These things can strike anybody. They don't change their shape or function once they get in your body, and you have to build defenses to prevent diseases. Okay, so there's a lot of ways we can build defenses. But what a lot of people don't know is there was another great scientist, and I think most French scientists that have studied history will recognize Antoine Béchamp as really the premier scientist of the 19th century, and he developed a whole nother theory and did many experiments to kind of demonstrate that his theory was a little bit more accurate, and it was based on the cellular theory. And it turns out that we have trillions of microbes in our body all the time, and they're actually most of them doing very good things, and we wouldn't be able to survive without them. And his theory was that the disease is more related to a poor environment, and in French that's le terrain, right, the terrain. And they also had evidence that microbes are polymorphic, which just means that they can change their shape and function depending on the environment. They're not just static things. You don't just get a virus and they stay a virus for the rest of whatever they are, or a bacteria. They can actually change their form depending on the situation. And the real disease really comes from unhealthy conditions. And he also talked about the cell as a battery, and it holds charge, electrical charge. So that's going to lead into my next slide. And I'm trying to keep this to simple. I teach this with high school students, people at all levels here. And so these are just fundamental things it's important to understand, because then when you hear things about, well, the only thing that microwaves do can heat you up, and that's what our guidelines are about, you will realize that has never been the case. And we've known that since before we probably even knew what a microwave was. Okay, so here's the traditional model, let's say, of a cell in your biology textbook. Probably some of us have seen this. You can look at it under the microscope. You can see some of these structures if you have a very high power microscope, and you can point arrows and describe what those functions are. However, every cell is composed of atoms, okay? And what is an atom? This is extremely important. We don't really see atoms. We can't see them under the microscope, but we know that they exist. And we know a lot about the properties of the atom. And when we actually understand and look at what an atom is, you'll realize that many of the models of our body, of the cell, are either oversimplified or incomplete, depending on how you want to look at it. And what you'll see is that this opens the door to many other possibilities of how the body acts, how it communicates, and how it responds to different types of energy. And just to show you one difference or one similarity between chemistry and electricity is that many of you probably have heard of a pH scale. And you can get paper at the drugstore to measure pH of your urine or your saliva, and you get a color, and the color relates to some scale of how acidic or how basic it is. And we can all think in terms of chemistry, in terms of defining that. But what people don't know is there is a direct one-to-one relationship between pH and electricity. And I'm putting that up on the slide just to show you that leading to this point that chemistry is a subset of an electrical system. It is a simplified version of what is happening. In fact, it's a language. I wouldn't even call chemistry a science. I call it a language, okay? So Oshman, who's written a book on energy medicine, and many other people have made similar comments. There are two ways of altering functions in the body. One is to add particular molecules to the system, and the other is to add the electromagnetic signature of those molecules. Now, just to get to this point a little further, I want to make the claim that everything can be defined in terms of an electromagnetic signal and signature. And that's more fundamental than what we normally are thinking of and learning. So let's look at chemistry again. Chemistry starts with the periodic table. Okay, you got all these tables, and there's definitions for each of those elements. Okay, we can talk about that. That's really where chemistry starts. However, each of those structures on that table, each of the elements, are actually atoms. So let's look a little bit more closely at what an atom is. Now, what I'm showing here on the right is kind of a static version of an atom, but I want to emphasize the point that when you take the proton and the neutron and the electron, those are the particles in the atom, and you look at how much volume they take inside the atom, it's almost zero. And I'm showing here how empty the atom is. And Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, knew that, so I have a quote there. There really is no matter here, there's no mass, it's energy here that's holding things together. And that's what all the great physicists told us 75 years ago. So I want to play a little clip of this so you understand this a little more clearly and what this, one more. So we could take this further and talk about even smaller than atom, but it's the same point. There is no limit here of how far we can go, but these structures are basically empty. Now, the interesting thing is that empty or vacuum, however you want to call it, does not mean there's nothing there. And this is also a misnomer. And we can talk, and really scientists today, even at the university, they might be aware of this if I brought it up, but they're not thinking this way. We're not taught this way, but it's extremely important because you'll find out it's not the structures that are most important, it's the energy. I'm gonna play, this is a couple-minute clip to talk a little bit more about this.
One of the most amazing things about atoms is that they are mainly empty space. If an atom were as wide as your arm span, then the electrons would all be whizzing about inside the volume enclosed by your fingertips. Meanwhile, the nucleus would be sitting in the center, and its diameter would be smaller than the width of a single human hair. So all of the atoms that make up you and me and all the seemingly solid things in the universe are mostly empty space. Now, this is incredible, but what is even more mind-boggling is that empty space is not truly empty. I know because I've seen it. This is a simulation.
Yep, my sister's on.
It was made using a supercomputer to crunch the calculations of quantum chromodynamics. Now, that is the theory of fundamental particles called quarks, the building blocks of protons and neutrons, and how they interact with each other through gluons.
What you're looking at here is the energy density of the gluon field fluctuations. Where the little red spots come out, the energy density is very high, and it fades down through the colors. So in the lowest energy field fluctuations, I'm not rendering this animation so that we can actually see into it.
And what we see is a bubbling soup of quantum field fluctuations that come and go incredibly quickly. The frame rate of this simulation is 1,000,000 billion frames per second. Now that is truly high speed. The dimensions of this box are absolutely tiny. They are millionths of a billionth of a meter, roughly enough space to stick 2 protons. But there are no protons here. This is a simulation of the vacuum on its own, what we normally think of as empty space.
Empty space is actually full of these quark gluon field fluctuations. And on average, it is possible to annihilate a quark.
Okay, so let me escape this. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so I just want to say, and the main take-home message here is that most of the energy in the universe is in this empty space. And so we can spend like years talking about what that means and the great Nobel Prizes that have come from that and the different words to describe it, like zero-point energy. The point is, these concepts have not made its way into the biology and physiology textbook. They're basically ignored, forgotten, or not understood. So we're not really talking about reality when we talk about what's in the textbook. We're talking about some sort of oversimplified version, and that's what's training most people today in this field. So we have to continue to realize what the reality is and why this is important. And as Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, said, there's enough energy inside the space in this empty cup to boil all the oceans in the world. So this is where the interesting stuff is. And when we want to talk about mechanisms, you got to start thinking about the whole picture, not just a simplified version of what we're often told. Let's see, what did I do? I think you can still see my screen, right? Okay, you're good. So just to go a little bit further, there's also another thing about the space that presents itself nature over and over again. And I don't want to go into much detail, but just to point out, there are patterns in nature that cannot be explained by random theory or anything else that repeats over and over again. One is related to the Fibonacci sequence. If you haven't heard about that, you can look it up. But basically, there are certain geometrical patterns, very specific patterns, that repeat over and over in nature, and they have a mathematical formula that describes them. This is related to a spiral, and you see it in DNA and in the cochlea in your ear, in the nautilus, and the shell, hurricanes, galaxies. It's the same type of spiral. It's not just a spiral. Same sort of thing called the golden ratio, which comes from the Fibonacci sequence. This is just predicting and actually visualizing how rivers bifurcate, dendrites in the brain, blood vessels in the heart. They take the same pattern and the same mathematical relationship. There's no explanation for this. It just is an observation, okay? Energy is the same way. There are ways you can actually directly measure energy fields from the body. This is using Kirlian photography. It's been around for quite a while. Some of you may have heard of it. It's ways of using long exposure cameras. You can actually see these patterns, and there are books written saying that these energy patterns relate to certain disorders or diseases. And if you do the right thing, you can heal them. I don't know, maybe, maybe not. The point is there are these fields and you can measure them and see them. All right. So unless there's any questions, now I'm going to give a few examples of why this is important and some discoveries that have been basically forgotten. I'm going to start with Tesla, although he didn't do a lot of medical stuff. He definitely made devices for other people to use, but I'm going to give an example and talk a little bit more about vibration. I want to try to keep on time here, so I might go a little bit faster than I would like, but what is resonance and vibration? So what I want to do is basically illustrate what that really means. And so this is one way to do it. Both of these use sound to do it. And sound is actually a type of electricity, but you don't have to worry about it. It's a vibration. And it's a way I can show you something that you can see. So on the left, if you put a drop of water on a slide and you start to vibrate it at different frequencies, low frequency, we play music, whatever it is. You can play low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency. The shape of that water droplet changes and it gets more complicated as you go to higher frequencies. You can do something similar with sand on a plate and you can vibrate it and get all kinds of intricate patterns and you can define that mathematically. The point is there are certain structures and resonances based on the boundary conditions that manifest based on the energy that's going in. Your body, of course, if I played music, there would be certain types of patterns that would be developed simply based on these principles I'm showing you here. Does it mean that's good or bad? Well, I don't know, it depends, but they exist. All right, so this as an example of vibration and how that can actually affect the body, this was based on a patent for Nikola Tesla from well, this is a quote from him in 1896, but the patent is on the mechanical oscillator. In New York, Nikola Tesla liked to do parties and play jokes, and he was kind of an eccentric person. But this was a device. He invited the mayor of New York over for a party. He had him stand on this platform, and he vibrated it at a certain frequency, which he could control. And this particular frequency basically started to activate his intestines, his peristaltic movement. And the mayor had to get off in about a minute or two and run to the bathroom. And so that's kind of the joke, and everybody was laughing. But the point was that he could change, by creating certain vibrations on this platform, he could create different measurable physiologic effects and behaviors, all kinds of things, nausea, in this case, for alleviating constipation. This was an article in the Times. This is a principle that's very important because it also will come into play with electrical energy as well. Now, when I first saw this, I said, oh, there must be something that exists today like this. Well, and it took me a little while, but eventually I did find something on Amazon called the whole body vibrator, and they have all kinds of other claims. There's no mention of Tesla on there. But it's the same kind of principle. So just to show you that it hasn't completely been forgotten, there are things out there like this. All right, so electromagnetic spectrum and scale. So let's look at that a little more carefully because will come in for the rest of my slides. So I'm showing here the spectrum, really a full spectrum going from a wave that is not modulating at all on the left to low frequencies up to very high frequencies. And you can see that the wavelength, the period of one cycle, relates to certain structures. That's showing pictures there, anywhere from an entire building, which is on the scale of many meters, to microwaves, which are in the centimeter to millimeter range. I've kind of got a little box around that. Down to getting to higher resolution structures in your body, a needle or cells, which will have kind of wavelengths of visible light, or ultraviolet light, and then you get down to X-rays and gamma rays, which is getting down to the atomic and even the subatomic scales. Now, there are these terms that you guys have probably heard, non-ionizing versus ionizing, and that's kind of listed at the top. And all that really means is ionizing just says for X-rays and gamma rays, which are able to do this, can directly knock an electron off its orbit, which can create all kinds of effects. As we know, X-rays, there is no safe level of X-ray exposure. There's always a risk for any kind of exposure because of that mechanism in particular. But that's all that it says. So calling all the other wavelengths or frequencies non-ionizing is a little misleading because it just says, oh, it doesn't knock an electron off. That's all it says, because non-ionizing does a lot of other things which are well documented. Okay. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as what I just said. We can't just look at frequency. It turns out a wave has many, many properties. In fact, this is way more complicated. To do an experiment with electricity or electromagnetic radiation is far more complicated than using a drug, for example. A drug, we can have a dose, we can inject it into a vein or something, and we can look at effects. We can change the dosage and look at that. There's a few things we can change. Electromagnetic radiation has infinite amount of possibilities here beyond frequency. You've got the amplitude, the intensity, the pulse modulation, and the spatial radiation pattern, the polarity. And we know that all of these things can and do affect the body. They affect organs, they affect cells. You can't always measure it because that requires very careful experiments. And it's hard to do anything below cellular resolution, so you can always do things maybe on a macro scale. And then to repeat experiments, imagine I tried to do an experiment here in Arizona and you tried to do it in Connecticut, another group tried to do it in Australia. A slight change in the environment could alter the result a little bit. So it's not necessarily so easy to reproduce. So sometimes you might not get exactly the same thing. And I'm not even talking about biological variability, which we all know each of us are different in many different ways. So it's not so easy just to say, let's look at a paper and see what the results are. All right. We're not getting to microwaves yet because I want to get to what people were doing 100 years ago. And there were a lot of positive things people were doing with electricity. And they were not using microwaves. They were using things below 100 kilohertz. And here that's referred to high frequency currents and electrical currents. These are two large, like huge, thick books. You can get the PDF. I don't know, some of these might have 1,000 or more pages. They're written by MDs. They're describing their experiences of using these, every part of the body from toe to head to toe and the heart and everything else. And they're describing the amazing effects they were getting and trying to figure out what are the key parameters, how does these things actually cause tissue to regrow or heal different aspects of the body. And they were working hand in hand with engineers at the time, including Tesla and many of the others. In fact, there were joint conferences by medical doctors and engineers, and the doctors would share their experience and the engineers would try to come up with better devices. This is what was going on 100 years ago. More than half of what I would call allopathic doctors back then were using electrical devices. And you can find Sears Roebuck catalogs with pages and pages of all kinds of electrical devices. And of course, naturopathic, there were equal or if not more naturopathic doctors at that time using the devices as well. So what happened here? That's why this is important. That's why history is important. So I have to play a little something to talk about what happened 100 years ago, 110 years ago, and this has to do with the transition into the pharmaceutical industry, because this was the period that was so important that would change medicine forever in this country, or at least until now. So I'm going to play this to give a little background to that. And I'm listing, books and documentaries that will fill in much more detail, but I have to play this just to get an idea, because you're going to say, oh, well, what happened to this? Well, let's see what happened to it.
And the balance of medical power remained equal until the turn of the century. Then new medical treatments emerged that were potentially very
Whoops, sorry.
AMA joined with strong financial forces to transform medicine into an industry. The fortunes of Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller financed surgery, radiation, and synthetic drugs. They were to become the economic foundations of the new medical economy.
The takeover of the medical industry was accomplished by the takeover of the medical schools. Well, the people that we're talking about, Rockefeller and Carnegie in particular, came to the picture and said, we will put up money. They offered tremendous amounts of money to the schools that would agree to cooperate with them. The donors said to the schools, we're giving you all this money. Now, would it be too much to ask if we could put some of our people on your board of directors to see that our money is being spent wisely? Almost overnight, all of the major universities received large grants from these sources and also accepted 1, 2, or 3 of these people that I mentioned on their board of directors, and the schools literally were taken over by the financial interests that put up the money. Now, what happened as a result of that is that the schools did receive an infusion of money. They were able to build new buildings. They were able to add expensive equipment to their laboratories. They were able to hire top-notch teachers. But at the same time as doing that, they skewed the whole thing in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs. That was the efficiency in philanthropy. The doctors from that point forward in history would be taught pharmaceutical drugs. All of the great teaching institutions in America were captured by the pharmaceutical interests in this fashion. And it's amazing how little money it really.
All right, so that's a brief little explanation of what happened. There's obviously decades to study what was going on at that time. But these are some important people that really transformed medicine to what we have today. And there are a lot of things that I think we should be embarrassed about, including book burning, going after people that, medical doctors for quackery. If they just used a device, there was no evidence for anything adverse. And, so there's a lot of history here, and I'm just listing some of the people that really had transformed things at that time, and that takes us into a new era. However, there were plenty of people that continued along those footsteps. You just don't hear about it, and they're not taught. Perhaps one of the most famous, Bjorn Nordenstrom, who wrote a book which you can download. It's several hundred books it's called The Biological Closed Electrical Circuit, Clinical, Experimental, and Theoretical Evidence for an Additional Circulatory System. He was called the Electric Man. He was one of the people he was the head of the body that chose Nobel Prize winners for many years. And as a quote, all living systems contain numerous functioning electrical circuits. These circuits exist in all bodily functions and determine the well-being of the body. Now, many people in the medical field will know him as the pioneer and as inventing the needle biopsy, which I think most of you will be familiar with. And he was ridiculed even for doing that. They said that was silly, no one would ever use it. Well, he was also ridiculed for the concept of thinking of the body as an electrical system, but he did do quite a few experiments all over the world looking at cancer and other things, and you can certainly research his work fairly easily on the internet, as well as videos and things of the news where they reported things that he did. So I'm going to go back a little bit, and maybe I'll go a little bit more quickly than I normally would through these slides. But Albert Abrams, many consider him the father of vibrational medicine. He was dean of the College of Medicine at Stanford, well-known neurologist and pathologist. You can find his books online. They're actually, that part are very amazing. But he kind of serendipitously made a discovery while he was examining his patients. And many of you know that doctors use palpation as a tool to diagnose. They will tap your belly, for example, and listen for air and other things going on in the body. And even doctors today still use that. The stethoscope is another version of that. But what he found was that he found strange things going on, and he connected it to an x-ray machine that was in another room. And every time they turned the x-ray machine on, he would get amazing changes in these people's muscles and stomach. And he couldn't deny it. And he started to look into it. And he started to realize that there was other things going on in the body, and especially the muscles and the abdomen and the nerves. And so the concept was he developed with a healthy body emits waves, like what he would call an electrical signature, which he could measure. And that disease states produced altered waves. and that abdominal nerves and muscles were highly sensitive to these waves, and that what later became known as a radionic device were simply a device that could play electricity back into the body. It could be tuned to the abdominal region. You can see a device there. And that he could get feedback on the subject by percussing, by tapping and listening at that time, and that the device could then be used to transmit healthy waves back into the person for therapy. So that's the kind of principle, that there are certain waves in certain people that can actually be healing, and there are changes in those waves that can be indicative of disease or disorder. Now, he's certainly not the only one. He was one of the original people that developed this, and he taught many students at Stanford these principles. The only problem is he has another name by many people, not just the father of vibrational medicine, but many call him the dean of quacks. So you got to decide, you know, what do you want to believe, or look into it and decide if there's something more to the story. Just as another person, George Lukovsky, who had developed this coil, I believe Nikola Tesla, he had worked with in developing these. You can still find these today. And they were used in hospitals around the country, certainly into the mid-1940s for decades, as a healing device. Mark Twain used them. Many historical figures use these devices. You see him sitting in between these. They basically pass very broadband electrical signals, current. There's static charges. You can kind of see the little sparks when you turn it up and take a picture there. And today people have measured these. They can deliver anywhere from 20 to 20 gigahertz, so even into microwaves, but it's very broadband. And the concept is based on what I talked about before, thinking of the body and the cell as a battery that loses its charge sometimes. And if you know which frequencies to play, or play a bunch of frequencies, your body will recharge itself using that energy. That's the general principle. And he did experiments in plants. You can find books where you can actually put tumors on plants and treat them with this sort of thing. And the tumors in plants actually have a lot of similarities with humans, so it's actually not a bad model. But he did also do it in humans, working with doctors, and you can find things where he used these coils and saw some dramatic effects. So the point is that this field definitely continued, but it was not really taught to medical students or in the medical field exactly. It was a little bit more of a fringe. People had to learn it in different ways, but it was still used in hospitals. Just as in another example, I'm going to actually maybe go kind of quickly through this. So Gadali is another example who discovered the power of light and different colors of light. When you shine light on the body, on the skin, you can get different effects. If you get too much light, you can get disease. You get too little light, you can also get disease. And he wrote a book and trained thousands and thousands of students. He was a prodigy that came from India. So by 17 or 18, he had all this knowledge, I don't know, and he went around and taught people. However, he wasn't always admired by everybody, and they definitely came after him as a quack and said that this is ridiculous, and they tried to throw him in jail. And it turns out, if it wasn't for some prominent medical doctors at the time, he may have ended up very much in jail. In fact, Kate Baldwin, who was a surgeon who used his light therapy all the time in healing patients from surgical wounds and would see a dramatic response. I'll quickly read this. For centuries, scientists have devoted, maybe I'll skip here, color is the simplest and most accurate therapeutic measure yet developed. I can produce quicker and more accurate results with colors than with any or all other methods combined, and with less strain on the patient. And that was, I believe, testimony to defending Gadali when they were trying to come after him as a quack and put him in jail. So the point is, there was always this pushback, even when they were getting good results, because these types of therapies, especially inexpensive as this, were a threat to the pharmaceutical system that was definitely rolling by the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Unfortunately, Kate Baldwin died a few years after this, and Gadali was eventually incarcerated later on. But is this really quackery? Let's look at today. What do we know about light therapy? This is established in the medical literature. We have things like phototherapy. Babies would die from jaundice if we didn't place a blue light on them to save their lives. So all hospitals have a blue light for that purpose. Light therapy is many papers on what we call seasonal affective disorder. migraines. There's many things that are accepted now, and this is a hot area, but we're talking about something that was being applied 80 years ago and essentially suppressed or put away or even put in jail in this case. So where is is there hypocrisy here in what we know and what we did know? So of course you can find all kinds of devices now. This is actually a big business, low level light therapy, Thor lasers. You can find these online. I have this device, which is photosonics, which allows you to put goggles and play different lights and different frequencies in your eyes and play sounds. And you can actually do experiments with those. Many devices like these. You can actually directly see the effect of light. And this is looking inside a cell. This is an organelle called a centriole. It's often called the eye of the cell. It turns out if you focus light inside the cell, you can just direct the centriole all over the cell. It will follow that light pulse. It's like attracted to the light for some reason. So there's direct evidence where very little light can have a big effect on, in this case, an organelle. You can move it around. Okay, I will get to microwaves in about 6 or 7 minutes because I know that we want to talk about that as well. But this is an important story, especially contemporary with all the talk about virus and electricity and vibration. And we don't even know about Royal Rife. Maybe some of you do, but everybody should know about Royal Rife because he was one of the most amazing scientists of the 20th century. He did not deserve what happened to him or the people that worked with him. But let's revisit what he did and some of his principles. So the first part of what I want to talk about Royal Rife is the amazing microscope he developed. This was recognized by the Smithsonian Institute as the microscope of the decade in the 1940s, along with the electron microscope, both of them together, 1940s. The universal microscope, the Rife microscope, whatever you want to call about it. We don't have supposedly functional ones, maybe we do, but whatever it is, we had 7 or 8 of them at some point in existence. We don't have them today, but what was it able to do? Okay. It was a microscope that could image and record living organisms in culture as small as 50 nanometers. Okay, that's 1/10 to 100 size of the bacteria. We really don't have microscopes that can do this today. Maybe there's some exceptions, but that's not something that would be routinely used in the medical school where I am, for example. I don't even know if they would have something to do that. In fact, most people don't even know that this research ever existed or some of the principles of this microscope. It had 6,000 moving parts. This is before the laser was even invented. So this is an extremely complicated instrument. People have tried to understand all the different components. I think we have a very good idea, but we have not, to my knowledge, rebuilt it exactly. But let's look at, so what's different about this microscope than the electron microscope is the electron microscope kills anything that's alive in the process. It just kills it, it destroys it. You can't do anything with it alive. So to see structures, and now you're getting on the scale of a virus at 50 nanometers, he could directly visualize and see this in its living state. So let's see what he discovered. Okay. So for 20 years, he and his colleagues did a lot of experiments, and this is what they learned. Depending on the microenvironment, organisms could morph into bacterium, virus, or fungus. 16 different states observed. These were also later observed by other scientists. But he recorded metamorphosis from one form to another, also known as pleomorphism. And he could take video or cine film, typically over periods of 1 to 2 days. What does this mean? It means he could have a particular organism in culture. He's visualizing it. He changes the V8, in this case, the next line says he changes the medium, like say the pH or the chemicals. He could get that organism to change its form, okay? It wasn't static. You could actually change it to one to another. Some microorganisms became larger and unable to pass through a filter, and with successive changes became visible under an ordinary light microscope. He could identify specific tiny microbes in blood in over 90% of cancer victims. So we would call that dirty blood. There is things that we can do today to visualize and actually treat that today. But he was looking at that directly. And you know, there's a lot of documentaries and information on Royal Rife and what happened at this time. I'm only going to give you, I want to give you a little background of the kind of the principle here, and I'm going to play another short movie.
At about this time, Rife began his work using frequency instruments. He told a reporter in a May 6, 1938 Evening Tribune article that he also experimented with electrical stimuli on various microorganisms, and he noticed the individualistic differences in the chemical constituents of the diseased organisms, saw the indications of electrical characteristics, and observed the electrical polarities in the organisms. Random speculation on the observations suddenly stirred in his mind a startling, astonishing thought. What would happen if I subjected these organisms to different electrical frequencies, he wondered. With this revolutionary thought, he began to gather all the necessary instruments.
Okay, so the main point here is that he made some discoveries with his microscope, and he worked with doctors, and as you'll see in a second. But he also had another idea because he was a bacteriologist. He was also an optical scientist. He was trained at Johns Hopkins University. He worked with Carl Zeiss, some of you may know as a pioneer in optical instruments. This guy was very talented in what he was doing, but he was also interested in cancer. And the reason he developed the microscope is because he thought the cause of cancer was something smaller than what could be seen under a regular microscope. And the stains itself, also histological staining, could not see those structures. So that was his motivation. And I don't want to get too much into that part of it. But the point is that he did come up with principles of resonance and vibration to treat organisms, meaning he identified these organisms in different scales. He developed a device that you're seeing there, which is a plasma device, which he could modulate at different frequencies. And he could look at the effects on the organism. So the second video is going to look at, the actual video you'll see is from larger structures. It's not specifically from Rife's microscope, but you will see the principle applied on a larger scale as it's being explained.
Rife found through arduous experimentation, looking through the microscope as he applied various frequencies, that he was able to kill these microorganisms, proving his theory to be correct. In order to determine which frequencies would kill a particular organism, it was absolutely essential that he be able to see the organisms in a living state so that he could observe the effect of various frequencies in real time. Rife later called a frequency which killed an organism its MOR, or mortal oscillatory rate.
Okay, so now he's using resonance frequencies. Think of a crystal glass, right? You have a singer, they hit the right note and the glass shatters. That's a short version of it. He's using the same principles here with electricity and organisms. There is no heat involved. This is causing these organisms to start to vibrate and destroy themselves by hitting just the right frequency, and you have to find that frequency. That's what his microscope was great at, because he had to see these structures to be able to identify those frequencies. So it's the general principle here. This is a story that has not been told enough to enough people. Not the only person to do this. He's just should be the most famous to have done this. I do want, yeah, so I have other videos of similar things of other people doing this, finding these frequencies with different organisms. There's a TEDx video here, which I'm happy to provide a link to that, which is another more modern version of a musician who went back into the cancer research and started to develop and build the Rife systems and do these things, and has his own experience. But I don't want to get too far off from where I want to get to. This is just some results from Rife, how he identified these different frequencies for different organisms and was able to apply those same principles. And again, I'm showing one frequency. If you're not using his original device, it gets a little more complicated than that. But using his devices, these were what he was able to identify in that. And he eventually used these principles to treat cancer, tuberculosis in clinical trials. He did hundreds of animal studies, guinea pigs, and many animals first. And then he did do clinical trials at University of Southern California. This is a video, a picture of 50 of the top scientists in the world that were involved in that. And that's again, a story not told. This is one documentary that I'm putting there. You can find other things online. But I don't want to go any more into this other than to say that most of the people in that room denied ever being involved in this project within several years, because To be able to treat cancer as successfully as those trials went with those 16 terminal cancer patients. They were never published by USC. We only have reports. Many people have asked USC to publish those results. They have not yet. But all accounts were that it was very successful, but that to have an electrical device, relatively inexpensive, that could have this kind of effect at that time was not something that was popular. And so that's all part of this, the history that we have to live with. But it's an interesting story nonetheless. Now, yes, you could say conspiracy theory, no question about it. It is a conspiracy theory, but it turns out US Congress in 1953 were constantly getting reports that the federal FDA and the AMA in particular were involved in suppressing medical research. So they hired a guy named Fitzgerald to investigate this. And you can find the report online. But basically, here's what his conclusion was. Public and private funds have been thrown around like confetti at a country fair to close up and destroy clinics, hospitals, scientific research laboratories, which do not conform to the viewpoint of medical associations. That's just taken from that report. Politics and Healing is I have that book here. I would recommend that. It's written by a state senator of New York who discovered all these stories behind closed doors and shared some of those, including Rural Rife and others, of not talking about these types of treatments. You just don't do that. So that's part of the story and part of history. I'm going to start skipping a little bit so I can get to the microwave here in a minute. This is an important experiment because it demonstrates that cells communicate using electricity. They don't need chemicals. You don't have to spray them with this or shoot them with that. This clearly demonstrates that cells can talk to each other through electrical signals. So this is very simple. And you basically can take cells from the same culture, separate them into two dishes, okay? And you have a window between them. And, okay, if you make that window glass, glass will block ultraviolet radiation, okay? So if you then do something to one sample, maybe you put a poison in there or I don't know, whatever you want, you poison it, you won't see any effect in the other cells. They're not aware that this is happening. However, if you use a quartz window, which allows ultraviolet light to pass, those other cells will be affected just because you did something to the other cells. There's some sort of communication going on. That's called the Kazanchev effect. He's Russian. Lots of out there to do that. So it's a simple principle. And they also have shown near infrared. They've done other things. Now, yes, if you talk to people, they'll say this is controversial. We don't always see that result. The problem is very few people even know that these studies were even done. So we need to have this as part of our conversation when we talk about the body and how cells communicate and how they work, so we can do those experiments and repeat them and understand them, okay? All right, one more minute. I'm gonna go quickly. Robert Becker is, one of my heroes. He's more modern. He was more mainstream, orthopedic surgeon, nominated twice for a Nobel Prize. I'm not gonna, you can see his quote here. We are now in the process of revisiting the past century's biochemical concept under which all major life processes are chemical in nature to one that proposes that such processes are electromagnetic in nature. And he was primarily at Syracuse, trained in New York, and did most of his work in the 60s and 70s. I'm not going to go into detail other than to say he was the first person to show how you could use electricity to regrow tissue. The right type of electricity, and he did this first in a frog, because normally you amputate the limb of the frog and it grows a stump. He showed if you apply the right kind of electricity at the stump, you can completely regrow the limb. So being an orthopedic surgeon, he applied this in other situations including humans, and had different effects. So he did a lot of other things with electricity. If you're not familiar with Robert Becker, I would recommend the Body Electric and Cross Currents, and I can provide those references after because you'll learn a lot of interesting things about electricity. Just to show you here, microbes, white blood cells, so your immune system that uses electricity. We might have heard that white cells, they navigate and they look for foreign matter and they eat them up and they shoot enzymes and they destroy their prey. Well, it turns out before they deliver enzymes to go after their foreign material. They're actually using electricity to stun what's going on. So, and that's all been described. So electricity here is paramount, or it supersedes any electrical effect over and over again, showing how a weak electricity can disable viruses. In this case, it's herpes simplex, and you know, there's a paper. You can find many, many papers on this. Also with HIV, many papers on this. Here's a device. I'm going to kind of skip over it, but this is a device that's been around since the 1930s, developed at Columbia, still exists today, even though it was banned by the FDA in 1972, despite like 100 articles showing that it's useful. And then after a 15-year battle, the FDA had to remove it through court order, and the court said they had to advertise it for the company because they tried to destroy the company. I mean, these are the stories that are out there. And this device particularly uses megahertz. We're not getting into microwaves. It's using 27 megahertz. It's just another story of certain frequencies can be healing. We've had Olympic athletes who've hurt their muscle during the Olympics and used these devices to heal rapidly, and the stories are out there about this device in particular. Okay, so the last one I'll just show is that I mentioned dirty blood. Well, it turns out you can have red blood cells here that stick together, which is on the left, but there are patents that describe, playing weak electromagnetic fields to your blood can clear them up, and you get more spherical blood vessels. This on the left, we might describe that as Rouleau syndrome, which is agglutinated blood. It's aggregated. We're going to see this again with microwaves, but this is actually showing a healing effect of cleaning up the blood using the right kind of electricity, and there are patents on this. You could have a device for a couple dollars that may have this effect. It's not very complicated of how to do this, and you know, you can do studies fairly easily and test this. I haven't done that. I'm only reporting what's here in the literature, what other people have talked about. All right. This is just to show the DoD has much more sophisticated things. This is from the 1990s of using an electromagnetic transmitter that could deliver pretty much any kind of electromagnetic wave. Here they're proposing it as a healing effect. So if somebody got some sort of disease, you put them in this chamber, you tune into the right frequencies and you treat them. So this is part of Department of Defense research, publicly available, 1990s. And another, that's part of that same system of how that might be applied. Okay, so electricity here is clearly important, and we don't talk about it enough. And here are some books that get into energy medicine, some of the principles. I've got many more than this, but these are some popular ones you can find by a neurosurgeon, by half of these are MD, you know, 3 of these are MDs, 3 and 2 have PhDs as well. So that is where I want to pause for a second, and I'm going to convert now to talk about microwaves, because until now I really have not talked about microwaves. But the point that I want to make is we don't know how electricity is going to affect the body until we do experiments, because any type of electromagnetic wave and any of the properties of that wave can and does affect a biological system. In fact, it may affect every cell in your body. Does that mean you're going to get a disease? No. Does it mean that it's going to heal you? No. Most of the time, you probably won't even notice because you got other things going on. What I did show you is a lot of evidence that there are low-level, non-thermal effects that can have a dramatic effect on these systems. And the only way that we really know is to first try to identify them, and then we can talk about mechanisms. But I hope you start to realize when you talk about mechanisms, everybody wants to talk about mechanisms. It doesn't matter if it's your grant being reviewed or you're in a room, and that's great. Talk about mechanisms. The problem is there could be hundreds of mechanisms that could be going on at the same time. So we all can have our own favorite theory, but what are the effects? Are they observable? Are they repeatable? That's what you want to know. And that's what we don't really talk about much. Okay, so I put this up here because, well, I just showed you a bunch of stuff. Many of you may not be aware of it. Well, what about the scientists? What about the people at the university? Why aren't they talking about it? The problem is when we're trained at the university, we're trained by the people that they were trained by and the textbooks. And the textbooks have not been updated or changed to represent a lot of the things that I talked about in the beginning. We will typically take what we're told going through school and we'll use that information. We have no idea that we're being delivered simplified, oversimplified models. We're not being explained in many cases the electrical systems at all. They're all chemical systems, which are just either invalid or incomplete. And so, and then we become very specialized. So most of us, if you're a medical doctor, you're an expert on the heart or the brain or a certain part. You cannot see the whole picture if you're only looking at one little piece. You'll just, and this is a fundamental problem that we have that we need to change. We need to change. In fact, probably quite a few people I'm talking to here are going to be more accepting of the information that I'm giving you, receptive, I should say, than most of my colleagues. Although I think that I could certainly, and depending on the people, I can certainly get into it. We just don't have, professors don't have time. They're so busy writing grants and they've been indoctrinated by certain things. It's hard for them to step out. It's the general public that needs to be familiar with this. Believe it or not, it's you guys and not necessarily the university. It's the students for sure, because they tend to have more open minds. But this is where the information needs to go. Okay. So I think I should have about 10 minutes on microwave and then we'll go to questions. So what about microwave radiation? So that's defined as 0.3 to 300 gigahertz. And many of us like to talk about 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G language. I understand we have to use those terms because that's what's popular, that's what the public is hearing, but I believe we're playing the game of industry when we use those terms because they really don't have a definition. In fact, they change depending on who you talk to. So can we say that 2G is safe? Can we say that 2G is unsafe, or 3G or 4G, 5G? To be honest with you, we can't say anything about any of those because they're not defined. And if we were to define them, if we had proprietary information, because believe it or not, if we talk about 5G, we're talking about pulse sequences. Many of them are not even proprietary, they're not even publicly available because the companies have patented some of these sequences. So we couldn't even just do a simple experiment on that specific sequence to know if it's safe. It's not even plausible or reasonable. So we got to be careful confusing the industry terms and safety with what they really are and what would actually be tested, let's say, in a court of law, okay? In a court of law, we can talk about what's considered reliable and, reliable and, I'm sorry, now I'm losing my train of thought. There's two R's, but reliable and one other thing, which relates to is the research relevant and reliable? Those are the two things that are relevant, are important in court, and that's according to Daubert 1993. So when you do get this to any court or to the Supreme Court, and specifically, you have a right to put into evidence reliable and relevant evidence to demonstrate whether something is safe or not. And what does that mean? Well, someone says 5G, well, you know what the range of frequencies are, you might know a little bit of the pulse sequences. If I have papers and publications are within the same range that show that it's safe or unsafe, the Supreme Court considers peer-reviewed literature the highest form of evidence. More recent, they give more weight to than others, but they give more weight to that than expert testimony. So expert testimony gets less weight. So you have to understand in court, evidence is something different than science, because from my perspective, scientific perspective, I can't tell you whether it's safe or not. I can tell you my opinion. I think it's not going to be safe to a lot of people based on what we know that is publicly available. That's how you have to think about it. And then to make the assumption that it's safe when it hasn't been proven safe, that's also important because you can't say that. So we have to think of risk based on what I just said and not based on what slogans people are throwing at you. Okay, so microwave radiation on the left, this is natural electromagnetic fields from the environment. And this is before we had all the stuff in the environment for microwaves. In fact, almost everything is going to be visible light. There's a tiny bit of microwaves from lightning, and then you have the Earth's natural magnetic field. It turns out almost all other frequencies do not make it to Earth. They're extremely low level. Okay, they're not natural. They can't get through the space, through the atmosphere, whatever it is. That's, microwave radiation is foreign. It's man-made. And so now you see more recently, in the last 150 years, with radio frequencies, radio, microwaves, now you got all these frequencies in our environment. Does that mean it's good or bad? Well, I don't know. I'm just saying that We didn't have those before. We need to be careful whether those are safe or not, okay? This is just another version of this, a little more complicated, but you can see the dramatic increases at the microwave frequencies over the last many years, with green being the natural background before in the 1920s area, and you've seen this dramatic increase. Well, is that good or bad? Is anybody asking the question? Okay, so going back, what about all these devices that we're using? And there are a lot of them here, right? A lot of these are all man-made microwave radiation. Well, when we talk about exposure limits, turns out US, Canada, and United Kingdom have what I would say higher limits, higher limits than anywhere else in the world. Why? Well, there's a history to that and the belief system, but the bottom line is that we in this country only recognize effects of heating of a microwave beam. So forget all the other stuff I've just talked to you until right now, this point. The only thing the regulation agency will acknowledge is a heating effect. Now, technically, there's also a cavitation, but we're not dealing with that. So basically, heating is the only thing that we'll talk about. If you say anything else, sorry, the literature's not there. Well, okay, that's their opinion. What is it based on? I don't know. It's a valid question. The other important part of this slide is look at Russia, China, and Italy. 1/100th the upper limit in microwave radiation from these devices. Israel and India is in between. You got Switzerland is 1,000th. Austria is 1/10,000th of the limit. So is it for some reason somebody in Austria more immune to microwave radiation than here? It doesn't make any sense. They're just different belief systems. And I don't know if the US, us, the people that live here actually believe it's okay to have higher microwave radiation. It doesn't make any sense. But first, we got to get the facts before we can talk about, what's safe or not. All of you, I hope by now realize that in the manuals for your cell phone and laptop, you can find this, and each phone is a little different. It specifically tells you, like for this, in this case, the iPhone 7, you are never supposed to have it within 5 millimeters of your body. It's not supposed to be in contact with your body. Well, how do you use a phone if it's not within, if you're holding it in your hand? Technically, you could be exceeding the limits just from heating. Again, I'm not even getting into the other effects. From their own guidelines, you could be exceeding it, and often you will if you're holding your phone in your hand or putting it up to your head, and it says that in the manual. Not supposed to do that. Now, you could, on the old BlackBerry, that number was 25 millimeters, not 5, but 25. And if you have an older iPhone, it might be 10 or 15. The point is, you're not supposed to hold it against the body, and I'll show you in a second why. Same thing with laptops. Did you know you're not supposed to have a laptop within 20 centimeters of your body? That's 8 inches. Well, that doesn't sound like a laptop to me. Maybe that's an industry term, a laptop. Maybe we should call it something else. But it's in the manual. I mean, do people know that? Well, City of Berkeley in California a few years ago passed a law specifically saying we want to inform our customers at point of sale about these warnings because it's buried in there. And so they passed a law, the law passed, and the industry sued Berkeley saying they're not allowed to do that. And about 3 months ago, the Supreme Court finally ruled that Berkeley does have the right to put that. And in Berkeley, I believe they're in the process now of warning people about this specific issue. And it turns out 12 other states are also allowed to pass a similar law. I know Arizona is one of them. I don't know about Connecticut. But again, this is just out there, common sense and accepted, not controversial. So this is what happens when you put the phone against your body. The microwaves couple much better. So the blue lines are when you keep it some distance from your body, according to, you don't have it in contact with your body, you keep it within the standard. But as soon as you have it in direct contact, there is the possibility that it can dramatically increase because you're coupling the microwaves into your tissue and you will exceed FCC guidelines. Okay, well, that's the reason. And how are these guidelines come up? I don't want to go into detail. I can always come back and talk more about anything that I've talked about. But the point is they use models. and they use tissue mimicking phantoms like you're seeing here. And in some cases, for the head model, it was a 220-pound male 50 years ago. They measured exposure and said, okay, if it's any more than this, the inside of the brain is going to heat up. That's where the guideline comes from. There's a much more of a story to that, but that's the bottom line of where that number comes from. For laptops, it's the same thing. You can do the modeling and figure out what the temperature is from the model. You can actually do measurements. Another important point here is that if there are negative effects of microwaves, children are going to be more vulnerable. Why? Because more microwaves get into their head. They're not protected by the skull. Their bones are not, their bone marrow is not protected by the bone and the blood. So they're much more in jeopardy. And you can see here how much more microwave energy gets into the head depending on your size. Guidelines, exposure guidelines do not differentiate between a large, heavy adult and a little baby. There's no difference. It's the same guideline, okay? All right, a little bit more on, what we do know, and I think rather than to go into too much detail on this, here's a couple studies, or actually a couple publications actually, but there's a lot behind these publications, but it's all you really need to know in some ways, okay? One publication by the US Navy in 1972 references something like 2,200 other publications describing all these effects. I know it's kind of hard to see, but the key here is I'm listing brain, heart, reproductive, eyes, respiratory, muscular, and within those, there are many other, brain, you got dizziness, fatigue, nausea, tremors. Under respiratory, you've got bronchitis, dry cough, itchy. All of these are referenced in that one paper. Later, we've got reviews that include 5,000 or 6,000 papers rather than 2,200 papers. The point is, there isn't a single part of the body that cannot be impacted by microwave radiation, and in a measurable way. It doesn't mean everybody's going to get those symptoms. It just means that they can, and it also doesn't mean it's it doesn't mean it's causing those things, right? Because as a scientist, you got to be very careful and avoid using cause. What we can say is it's a causal factor, maybe, but why would one person get this and the other person not? You can't call it a cause if this person doesn't get it and this person does. You can say, well, it's a factor. Well, maybe that guy had a bad diet, or this person also had some X-ray exposure, or, there's many other things. That's the point here. But the point is that microwaves certainly appear to be, based on over 10,000 papers, causal factors of a lot of almost every single disorder you can think of can be caused or impacted by microwaves. The publication on the right, Biological Effects and Health Hazards of Microwave Radiation, is published. It's hard to get that and very expensive. You can find online an electronic version of this. This is based on a conference sponsored by WHO featuring the 60 top scientists in the world who shared their research. At that conference, there was no debate whether low-level microwaves can affect the body, the cell, the organ. The debate was, what are the different mechanisms? And you can go in and look at all the different things they talked about. And here are just two publications, and again, well over 1,000, 10,000 to 1,200 government studies, peer-reviewed. There's too much. There's not one smoking gun. There's too many smoking guns that are going to flood the scientific argument if you're ever in a position to do that. Well, yes, there are papers that say, well, this didn't seem to have an effect, but before we even get into that, look, here's the evidence of sponsorship bias. Who's publishing the study? So roughly 80% something like 60 to 70% of studies sponsored by industry simply didn't find an effect of the microwave radiation. 30 to 40% still did, but 60 just did. But if you look at all the other studies that are independently funded, you find close to actually about 80%, I think, if you look at the totality. This is a peer-reviewed study where they looked at this to show sponsorship bias, or also known as publication bias. So that exists, it's aware, that has to be part of the conversation when you're looking at the publication. All right, I'll just give 2 or 3 examples of the kind of things that you can see, and then I'll break it up into questions. I know I've gone a little bit extra. I hope this was useful. and I'm happy to stay on for as long as you want to answer questions. If you use a dark field phase contrast microscope of the human blood, you can make beautiful images like these. And you can see the example there is healthy red blood cells, clean plasma, round RBC, red blood cells, and they're separable. That's a nice looking blood right there, okay? All right, well, they did a study looking at, as I recall, low exposure, carrying exposure, and active exposure in comparison. And you'd have to go into that study there that I referenced to look at details. I remember it's something to do with just carrying your cell phone, that middle one, for a certain amount of time. And they remeasured the blood, and you can see how you start to see different patterns. You see things starting to stick together, even with low exposure. This is a female at 75 years, this effect is more dramatic in elderly people, by the way. Carrying your cell phone, this is the definition of rouleau, and on the right, active exposure, where you start to see spiking and they start to change their shape, also known as echinocytes. This is not healthy. Does it mean you're going to get a disease? Well, probably if it went on for a long time, you might. But it turns out your body can recover. So if you turn it off, you go to sleep, because they've looked at school teachers who are exposed to Wi-Fi. They've seen these effects. They go home, they rest, they come back the next day. They seem to be better at the end of the day. So these are reproducible, fairly easy to measure. I would like to see more scientists doing these studies, and because they're fairly easy to do. But there's plenty of people out there doing this, and it goes back a long ways. In fact, one of the first articles I'm aware of was in 1927, which describes something called the Pearl effect, which describes exactly this, how microwaves can make these particles stick together like this. So it's not a new thing, but it's certainly dramatic. And it's not just about blood. This is showing DNA. This is the largest study conducted by the European Commission in 2004, called the Reflex study. And we're directly looking at effects of ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. So in this study, they used X-rays. So here's the sham of what it should look like on the left. That's a nice, healthy, this is called a comet assay. So it's supposed to look like one circle, kind of like that. The second one is when they exposed gamma radiation of 0.5 grays, which is the equivalent of 1,600 chest X-rays. That's what happens to DNA. You get this streak. It looks like a comet. And on the right, 24 hours of mobile phone RF EMF, 1.8 gigahertz, fairly something that someone might be doing today, although it's 24 hours. You see a very similar pattern. So forget about ionizing and non-ionizing. They're words, but they don't really mean anything other than what they're defined to mean. You can get dramatic effects from low-level non-ionizing radiation. And there's one example. By the way, NIH, National Toxicology Program, earlier this year published their largest study of $30 million. They also published the same effect using cell phone, and there are many others actually that describe this. So it's not an exception. Okay, I did want to just show a couple things on blood-brain barrier, and then I think I'm almost done. So I do a lot of things in brain with imaging. My background is actually I didn't go too much in my background, but my PhD is in neural engineering. And then I later went and worked in an ultrasound lab where I worked for 5 years. So I have, a special interest in the brain, and also different techniques I'm working on for imaging the brain. So the blood-brain barrier is, as you can kind of see here, is so important for so many things. It has to do with cognitive function, of course, but it also has to do with your immune system. Your blood-brain barrier is a system that's in place to protect your brain from foreign materials like viruses that aren't supposed to get in there, but also from heavy metals, aluminum, lead, different things. You want to have a healthy blood-brain barrier to keep things out of your brain. However, there are certain things that will expose that barrier and make that more permeable, so things that can get into your brain, and you're going to have all kinds of problems if you get a lot of stuff into your brain that you can't detox and get out. So what happens with microwaves in the brain? Well, I'm listing three papers there. There's many out there. The bottom line is that microwaves can impact the blood-brain barrier. Here's an example from Dr. Leif Salford, who's been studying this for 30 years. And here's one result. You can actually find a YouTube video that I referenced there. We goes more into that. Relatively low levels. This is a rat brain. You see the sham control on the top. What you're looking for are these brown spots, which indicates that the integrity of the blood-brain barrier has been jeopardized, and you can kind of see these spots. So this is just 2 hours for a rat, 915 megahertz. That number there, 8 milliwatts per kilogram, is 100th to 1,000th the limit right now that we have in this country for exposures, and this is for 2 hours. And he talks quite a bit about there's this window where if you have even low levels can be more dramatic than high levels. And this has actually been repeated, and I'm showing another paper down there on the left where they did show this also effect. There's a window where even low exposures, and you can then start to ask questions, well, why would low exposure? Well, intensity is not everything. Your body has certain things in place to protect itself. I'm just kind of presenting the data rather than going too far into this. And that's just showing histology where you can see this brown kind of haze around some of these blood vessels indicating that you're getting leakage. There's other studies here that are going to tell you the same thing. I'm going to kind of wrap things up here. Okay, the last thing I will say with microwaves, just to let people know, because this is so established and nobody knows about it. It's kind of sad. And this has to do with the microwave auditory effect. So this has been known for, well, first publication 1961. So that's 60 years. You can modulate a microwave beam on your head and you will hear it. This was known since the first radar transmitters went up in the 1930s. And it's been well described, well documented. There's a book on it. It's called the microwave auditory effect. There's other things. It turns out you can modulate, and you don't need much power. If you pay attention, you can actually hear this in the right situation and conditions. There's been psychophysical studies to document this. The key is that you can actually encode any type of sound into your head and actually hear it. It could be a voice, it could be any kind of noise, and there's a patent there that I'm showing from 1992, how you can create pretty much any sound that will be perceived in the head. You will use a microwave beam and it goes to the cochlea, the inner ear, that will be perceived as a sound. It refers to microwave auditory effect. I'm bringing this up because I know a lot of people have issues with tinnitus these days. There are a number of papers showing how cell phones and microwaves can be a causal factor in tinnitus. And so it doesn't mean it's the only thing it can do it, but it can. And here's one of the main mechanisms of how that can happen. And just to be aware of it and then think about that. Now, what I didn't put anywhere in here are tips and things that you can do to improve, but maybe that will come out in the questions, because I can stop now and I might be able to bring up slides to complement that as well. So I pretty much am going to stop there. Sorry, I went a little bit over. Hopefully there's still people on there that have questions.